But with this in mind, then we will go to the second part of the presentation, which is then really the suggestions and the proposals that we have come up with. And with that, I'm giving then the floor to the second presenter, which is Joshua.
So, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. I'll try to turn on my camera while presenting as well. There we go. So, as Naga said, we are here with you today to tell you a little bit about what we're looking into with regards to the next program, what kind of suggestions we would like to put forward. The starting point really is the work that has been done first and foremost in the context of the Online Learning Agreement project, which is in its currently second incarnation. Of course, that a group of few universities, whether it's 10 partners or so, cannot necessarily capture the needs of all of the higher education ecosystem, and that's why we felt it was important to share some of our ideas with you so that we can have. Sorry, I muted myself briefly. I think I'm back. The first thing I wanted to talk with you about is the question of recognition. It goes a little bit beyond the aspects of simplification that we've seen in the word cloud, although of course I think you're referring to the broader setting of all of the documents that are part of the Erasmus workflow. We're going to really zoom in into all learning agreement for the time being. And the first thing we would like to put forward, it's incredibly practical. It has to do with the fact that we all know that there are limitations in the way that different institutions approach the learning agreement, how comfortable they are committing to things in different points in time. And this is something that is begging to be streamlined, at least as far as our discussions have taken us. So I think we need to be transparent about the fact that the Before Mobility Learning Agreement is essentially a preliminary learning agreement. So the strength of the guarantee that, for example, the host university, the host higher education institution can give regarding the availability of the courses, let alone their schedules, needs to be acknowledged that it's going to remain a weak point. So we need to start calling a spade a spade. During the mobility learning agreement is when eventually we have a final learning agreement. And there is something interesting to discuss. How do we transition from one to the other? Whilst the after mobility learning agreement, which very few institutions use, at least to the best of my knowledge, is essentially a transfer of records. Maybe there's no need to duplicate what we call and the support infrastructure that we have for each. So to zoom in a little bit on the question of what's the difference between a preliminary learning agreement and a final learning agreement, the first thing we would like to put forward is the notion that maybe it's not useful or necessary, or at least strictly necessary, that the host university signs the preliminary learning agreement. The preliminary learning agreement, at least in our discussions, has always been seen as a way to have a strong guarantee that the sending institution is willing to recognize and commits to recognize the credits of the students. So we're essentially looking at a bilateral relationship between students and this sending university. Let's assume that this process is successfully completed. It should be, it's a requirement for going abroad, even if it's not always respected as such. What we're then looking is two possible pathways to transform a preliminary learning agreement into a final learning agreement. The first one is whereby no changes are needed, which is of course a very best case scenario. Statistically, this is not what tends to always happen. But then again, we also know that when we work with mobility windows and others, there are other ways to make this, to bring this reality about. But it's really institution dependent, study program dependent. And so if there are no changes needed, we could discuss about after a certain number of weeks, the learning agreement essentially becoming locked, becoming a final learning agreement, mutating, if you will, from a working document to something that seems to have no need to be further developed or updated. The majority of the students, however, will change the learning agreement, and at this point, we think it's fair to ask the host institution to make a commitment and sign in the form of what we usually call a signature, but we will come to what we will call it in the next program a little bit later. And so here we would have the three parties essentially saying, okay, this changes is something that we're all comfortable with. The sending institution will always have to confirm that this is all right, because it brings us back to the question of recognition. The hosts, I think if we could skip the step on the first point and before the mobility, we would be saving ourselves a lot of trouble. The last piece of the puzzle of this process that we would like to put forward is the notion that, for example, in the current online learning agreement, what we have is pretty much a carbon copy of a pen and paper process, of a carbon process, if you will. And this was a requirement for reasons of making sure that audits and compliance were perfectly suitable, adequate, that there would be no problems for anyone starting to go digital. As of the next program, we think that this could be simplified further by essentially enabling having one learning agreement which has different versions, which has a track history of the changes that are made to it, which is very transparent as to whether it has been signed by all or some of the parties. And so that in the event of an audit, for example, anyone can quickly check what's the history of that document, what happened to it, without necessarily having to go from one document to another. So it's essentially the same document. Its behavior needs to be defined so that it's very clear what it is. And we can also communicate, we need to be able to communicate this to the students doing mobility in a much more intuitive way than it's currently the case. Obviously, from the moment we go digitally, presumably we're not going to be losing the copies of the documents, et cetera, et cetera. So that's something that we're not going to go into. The next point we wanted to talk with you about is the question of automatic recognition, which of course has been the object of a council recommendation, which is, I think for many of our colleagues, feels a little bit like science fiction because we're still trying to fix the normal recognition processes and making them work for everyone, but that we think has merit to be added to the current discussions of where we want to go. So the essence of our suggestion here is to already at the learning agreement to make it explicit whether the students have a firm guarantee regarding the recognition of the various learning outcomes, for example, the ones listed in Table A, if memory serves me right. When this is the case, there should be no second evaluation, provided that the process of signing the learning agreement has been duly engaged with, that it's a conscious signature. This is also the logic of saying, well, let's not add signatures and validation that are just a pro forma. Let's make sure that when an institution commits to this document, this is generally a clear commitment. If there are learning outcomes that for some reason will not be recognized, this should also be visible, this should also be transparent. This is something that we think could be a bit of a game changer for the students, because we still have, unfortunately, many cases where recognition doesn't work as well as it can, but also for the universities themselves, because we are not doing ourselves any favors when we go to the trouble of vetting a document like a learning agreement, and a professor or an academic responsible will go over the different proposals for recognition and equivalence. And then we have to do everything again when the student returns. It's essentially duplicate work. And so if the changes have been duly vetted, this is something that could help us simplify and streamline our own internal procedures. And so in short, what we're saying is there should be no disclaimers like the ones that we currently find sometimes written on the sides of the learning agreement saying, well, maybe we will, maybe we won't. I think we need to take this to the next level. It is perhaps a little bit ambitious, but I think it's not beyond the education community as such. Now, at this point, there is the risk that what I'm saying will have upset some of you. So to play it safe, I will give the floor back to Daigo so that she can take us through some of the other issues that we'd like to put to your consideration. So thank you.
So yes, thank you, João. And if you can go to the next slide then. So one more very important thing that we wanted to stress and actually discuss within this context is, so yes, the commitment as such and how it's communicated. And in the current program, what's already possible, what's already allowed, the scanned signatures already was a nice stepping stone and a step closer to something that can actually help both the institutions and students even more, which is going to, firstly, of course, the digital signatures and something that is really and truly machine readable, but also from signing to validation. And what is possible and what we are going at is to basically advance it even further and make sure that there is a chance to confirm and there is a chance to basically validate with a click of a button. And what that would mean is that what the process that is happening behind is really the authentication and authorization that allows to make sure and clearly identify who is the person who is communicating this commitment, and in that sense performing this the signing process, so to say. And what also, of course, needs to happen next to that is that there is a firm and clear statement from the program that that yes, machine readable form is all that is needed, and basically that ensures that all the key processes, which is then the quality assurance and also audit requirements, are fulfilled. Because effectively, that's of course the question then, why there are some institutions and there are some places where we are still kind of going back to the paper and signed and sealed copies. The moment when there's firm commitment that machine readable signature is all and commitments is all that is needed to fulfill the audit and quality assurance and administrative requirements, that then makes it actually of course possible. Next to that, we are also, of course, seeing that it's not a rare case that there is more than one signature requested for a learning agreement. And at the moment, the template already very clearly suggests that there is one commitment per institution. And of course, there are cases like the double degrees and yes, situations when it's, so to say, practiced in a more well, objective fashion, but at the same time, it is still something that can be an obstacle in the recognition process. So the way the template is at the moment with one commitment and one legally binding commitment per institution is, in our perception, a way to go also for the next program and for the next framework. And in line with that, so those people who are sharing those commitments, and if you can go to the next slide, at the moment we have two fields that are indicating the, so to say, the contact and well, people that are interacting with the learning agreement. And the contact and responsible, very often are exactly the same person. So often this field is actually quite obsolete. At the same time, we are also aware that there are big institutions where maybe having a contact point and having the person who's maybe reviewing it, it's also a key thing to have. So the idea is there is a way to use the information that is already maybe available within interinstitutional agreement on contact points per institutions, and that data can be fetched from there. So there can be a central contact point for incoming and also outgoing students established per institution. That is already default, and that is always ensuring that there is no dead end, and the learning agreements can always be reviewed and they will not be disappearing somewhere. And the staff changes, which of course we are also very aware are quite often the case within institutions, would not interfere with this process. So this one central contact point for incomings and outgoings would be able to cater for that. The next to that, to have more clarity from the student side on this, on the contact and responsible person, we're also thinking maybe it's worthwhile to really specify more clearly within the learning agreement of what exactly the responsible person means. So it's really a responsible person for signing the learning agreement. And what is also the case within the different stages of the learning agreement is that due to these staff changes, this person can change as well. And the one that signed the learning agreement before mobility, or yes, the primarily learning agreement, or the one that is final, those might be two different people. And at the moment, the template, it has to also clearly, of course, foresee that that change is possible. At the same time, there also needs to be an absolute clarity that the different people being the ones signing it before or during does not have any consequence on the actual commitment that is being communicated there. And because learning agreement, of course, is legally binding document, and that shall not interfere in any kind of way with the recognition process. So yes, then I'm giving floor back to João.
Thank you very much, Saga. I'm going to stay on this slide just for a second because there are some interesting comments on the chat box, particularly from the colleagues from Zagreb, which are correctly pointing out that we need to be realistic on what can be achieved. But I just wanted to point out that for the context of these discussions, we actually modeled some of the possibilities that we're presenting to you on an even more difficult landscape than one with 34 contact points. So one of the OLA project partners was and is the University of Vienna, where there are around, if memory serves me right, 120 mobility coordinators. So very clearly, it's not going to work just through a single contact point. And so there is a measure of plasticity that we need to consider for smaller institutions, where this might be the reality of someone that receives, centralizes notifications and liaises with the relevant persons to activate them, or larger institutions where typically interinstitutional agreements are made at the level of the faculty, and that's where Daigo was saying that maybe that information can then be fetched. Obviously, this speaks to the need to have a continuum between the interinstitutional agreement, the learning agreement, but this is true for many of the steps of the process that need to become kind of weaved closer together, and that was something that was shown as well on the word cloud by the feedback that some of you provided. Moving past that point, which we can always come back to in the questions and answers, the next recommendation is very simple. I'm happy that I get to say this one out loud. If we're going to go digital, this is really not going to work too well if we keep the possibility to attaching annexes to what is no longer a document. We're essentially moving from documents to data, and so we need to make sure that information that is currently contained in the annexes, when used, that it's part of the data structure of the learning agreement. This shouldn't be too radical a change of paradigm, but nonetheless, it requires us to think through some habits that we take for granted, but might not travel very well or might not make sense in the setting of what we want to see in the new program. Now, talking of connecting things, let's talk about the very old and very big problem, which is the course catalogs. It's been in the guidelines for a long time. I think we all know that the reality is that this is one of the most difficult steps of the process. So this is not a recommendation as much as giving a bit of an insight on some of the things we're still experimenting in the project with, and that we will be keen to present to you hopefully very shortly. And to extend the conversation to how do we solve what is essentially an historical and an infrastructure problem. So something that many universities have done when they have their own systems for managing these steps is connecting the course catalog to the learning agreement generator or interface. And this is something that we would like to see more of, because obviously it makes it much easier if students click a button and they can navigate through their course catalogs, where they might even have different levels of access as to modules that are available for outgoing or incoming students, rather than if we keep copy pasting things and dumping them into what is essentially a PDF template. There could be interesting connections that could be made at the level of the local systems. The same is true to the dashboard to a more limited extent, because evidently it's a cloud-based system. And so both the online learning agreement and the Erasmus without paper already have worked on infrastructure to make these connections at a relatively simple and at a relatively complex level. And so if you're interested in this, do get in touch, because we would appreciate having more partners that are willing to try out setting up these connections. As I've said, I think we have solutions for relatively simple technical requirements and more advanced ones, and they have been published as well in something called the Open Source University Alliance, where all of the code source of this kind of APIs and programming interfaces is, of course, available. But it's going to be an issue, and it's going to be an issue that presumably we'll have to discuss in the context of the next program. Now, some small remarks to wrap up from my side before giving the floor back to Daiga. Some small tweaks, really now focusing on questions of simplification. And this might be small in the grand scheme of things, but with regards to, for example, international credit mobility, we all, I think, know that Key Action 103 and 107 are becoming closer together, and we hope that this can be manifested as well in some of the templates that we have. Maybe this should be the same, maybe it's not possible that they're the same, in which case it should be as close as possible. And this obviously then needs to extend to questions as mobility tool and the way the reporting is done, and to make sure that there is a certain coherency in the data fields that are being moved around, so that we can avoid having to add elements that should already be part of our templates. So an example is the question of the learning agreement for traineeships and the mobility tool reporting for traineeships, where there could be a greater convergence. Now, the last topic, I will give the floor back to Daiga, which is about data minimization. if she would be happy to take us a bit further on this.
Yes, definitely. And so yeah, if you don't mind, go to the next slide. So first and foremost, when it comes to the data minimization, we are also very happy to see the developments that are happening in the projects that are well, part of the European Student Card Initiative, the global well, idea and all the efforts that are being made by many projects and many consortiums. And one of those projects is My Academic ID, which is then dealing with creating a unique student identifier. And basically what it helps us to do and what it allows happening is discarding many of the personal data fields, because that would be an information that is already embedded in the European in this European student identifier, and there will be no need for additional indication and for additional processing and kind of going around with it. So there's no need to include those aspects in the agreement, and which allows basically for the minimization of personal data. The same, of course, applies also about the data about the institutions. Of course, it's not personal, but in general, what many of the developments allows us to do is to really kind of minimize the different kind of entries and different kind of data that is attached to it, and just kind of sending it around, because yes, there's no need. It can be acquired in different places. And if you don't mind, then going to the next slide. In line with that, when we have this clarity that, for example, yes, there is a European student identifier and it already embeds all the key information and all key data about the student, and there's no need to exchange it. It's still the question of these fields and these aspects that we are asking for. And one of the key questions that, well, I have always been very curious about is some of these fields, they actually really have to go through the scrutiny of why are we even asking for them? And one of them, for example, would be sex. And why is it binary value? I think that to a certain extent, lately the discussions are quite unanimous that there needs to be updates and there needs to be more inclusion in this in this topic. But at the same time, yes, there are some of those variables that are clearly very useful when it comes to research and when it comes to having statistics and having a way to, well, monitor and measure what is really happening. But at the same time, in line with the values of GDPR, we really have to think of it and really kind of see whether it really kind of holds the scrutiny of that and actually is of great help. So yes, minimization also in line with what is really necessary to know. It's also something to really look into. And in line with that, and kind of going to the next slide, of course, the compliance and the GDPR aspect is a very important one, and of course, at the very heart of the whole digitization topic. And it's also clear that the moment when the online learning agreement is created and processed and the data being exchanged, it's already quite a mid-stage of mobility, because the student has already applied for the mobility and has been nominated. So it's also clear that the consent for student being aware of it and student agreeing to it needs to be communicated before that. And it could be the application to the mobility stage. It could be also the whole enrollment at the institution, if, for example, the mobility is mandatory part of the degree. But of course, it's a very big topic, and we have already announced, and in case you are not aware yet, we'll have a more detailed webinar dealing with these topics in January, on the 20th of January. The time stays the same. And yes, and that will be the place to have more detailed discussion on the compliance matters and different solutions that are applied in different institutions, and how all of us, the higher education sector, can work towards improvement in this field. And with that, I'm giving the floor back to Jean.
Thanks, Saga. We're going to wrap up because we want to leave some time for discussion. I've seen there's quite a bit of it going. I hope it's not just about the question of how many signatures, because that's important, but we need to go somewhat more holistically. So I think the short summary of where we're at now is on the question of automatic recognition, that we hope that the next program will be a vehicle to bring about, essentially stop with the excuses why this can't work and focus on what does work. And we do have quite many universities that have successfully implemented more ambitious mechanisms to advance these processes. The question of transparency is a very big one. I think sometimes I'm at discussions where we talk about the fact that students don't want to go abroad, but and there are a multiplicity of factors, but we have to consider it. One of them might be simply the uncertainty and the experience that could be improved further. Obviously, it's up to us to try to do so. A lot of it has to do with streamlining, with avoiding asking for repeated information or having steps that take place multiple times that don't necessarily add value to our work, or rather subtract from it. And of course, we have the question of data minimization, which is essentially a legal requirement as of now. And that I think it's part of a larger cultural change that we all have to undergo, and that needs to be reflected as well on the way the processes are designed moving forward. And I think with this, we would wrap up our side of the presentation. I know that Taiga will have to leave us very soon. There are flights to be caught and meetings to go to. Taiga, could you just tell us whether we proceed, whether there's a possibility to for the colleagues to unmute and to have this live, or do we have to rely on the chat box to have questions going back and forth?
It is possibility to unmute the microphones, but well, we are 107 here, so that that will need to be done in a very orderly way. As I said, I still have well 10 minutes before I have to leave. Unfortunately, really I have to catch the flight, but we can try to you can try to post the questions in the question section, and we'll try to address them there, or as well, yes, there's an option to unmute the microphone and state them in, well, state them also orally.
Okay, thank you. So to get the ball rolling, I wanted to go back, I think, to the very first comment that I've glanced in the comment box, essentially to subscribe it. And I think it's a beautiful way to encapsulate something that we were both trying to say, which is that notion that a recognition at home does not need a signature from the host's university. I think this is one of the main messages that we want to put forward. From the year onwards, okay, let's try to combine the chat box with maybe some of you trying to go live with the audio. With 100 people, this might get a bit chaotic, but it's going to be a try and error, and we'll see how far we can combine both mediums. Okay, I'm going to jump into the last question. I'm visually challenged, so I'm just reading as they pop up. Clarify the question of data minimization from the colleague from Zagreb, Ida. That's, I think you've put your finger on attention. You know, our tendency is to get more and more and more and more data, but that basically is running on the face of what is currently a legal requirement. So I guess the message here is that every element of data that is requested as part of the process, be it on this or other templates, essentially there needs to be a very concrete reason why we do so. You know, what's the added value, what's the relevance? And it would be easy to say that everything feeds into further research, but this is where I think we need to come together and also criticize some of what might be our habits. You know, do we really need this piece of information? Do we have to try to go perhaps in a more straightforward way? Have we ever used it, or often have we used it over the last couple of years? I think someone mentioned at some point that different institutions have different realities, and that's obviously the case. But there is no point beating around the bush that once you go digital, you're essentially dealing with data standards, and those should be commonly agreed. And so the more we have clarity on this matter and kind of a shared consensus, maybe not everyone is ever going to be happy about this, but essentially we need to be able to move forward. There was another question just before that about student identification. I think the question was what kind of systems will be applicable or could be deployed to that effect. And sorry for the background noise. Essentially there I think the discussion about student identification gets very technical very quickly. And so the reference point there is a project called My Academic ID. Maybe we can drop the link on the chat box. And this is essentially building on the discussions of the European Student Card. And the approach there is to use something called federated identity management, which in practice is known to many of you as EduRoam or EduGain, depending on your familiarity on the topic. The basic principle there is that most of the universities in Europe, a strong majority, but not all, they're essentially connected to one another through a national federation for just the purpose of managing student identities. So what happens there is that a student from Luxembourg, for example, might go to the University of Zagreb and not just use the Wi-Fi, which is a use case that I think we're all familiar with, but eventually also access maybe the LMS or other online services that are, developed for that university. The university recognized the student from Luxembourg as being a student, if not from the same university, and depending on the configuration of your local systems, it will deploy the correct permissions. And so this is something that we would be looking to expand and to connect with an element of the European Student Card, which is called European Student Identifier. I would love to go in more detail on this. I would just perhaps say to wrap up, because it really is a very technical issue, or it can become a very technical issue, that there is a blueprint for this that is about to be published in January, and it's really not about creating new systems or reinventing the wheel, but rather by combining existing infrastructure and essentially bootstrapping what is European Student Card in one end, which is very important and useful. It has potential for identification, with EduGain, which is an incredibly powerful solution for authentication, which is very widely used, with as well another element, which is the eIDAS directive, whereby all European Union citizens will essentially be issued with, at some point, which is still a bit unclear with regards to timeline, with a digital identification mechanism, whether cards, tokens, or others. And so these three systems need to talk to each other so that we avoid redundancy. Now, a couple of other questions. I'll take one that is very easy for me to try to answer, because I will actually not be able to answer it. Will OLA be used for the 107? Well, the first thing is I can't make a political decision. It's not to the project partners, as in any Erasmus project, to be too assertive on this. I can tell you, however, what we are trying to do as what is now the OLA 3.0 strategic partnership, which is essentially to make the OLA available for KO7. We're still at the point of piloting, and it's not difficult because the infrastructure is there, and okay, we need to understand how the templates will eventually look like, but that's not really the difficult part. The difficult part is how do we provide access, whether for students or institutions that are outside of the program countries, and that would require another kind of vetting process in order to access the digital tools. And so there are some ideas of how we can go about this. But from our side, I think it would be too early to say too assertively that absolutely we can do this without breaking sweat. So we're going to be exploring solutions for this, particularly in the first half of 2020 as the project moves on, and we will be sharing these results with the community also to, maybe some of you have some ideas of how to go about this. Another question is, how will the course catalog be implemented and who will be doing it? So the how, and the short answer is essentially it means that you have your own system. What is required is for you to set up a connector, which is usually called an API, an application programming interface, a small bit of code that allows for information from your system, and in this case, the course catalog system, to be shared, for example, with your partners, whether for loan agreement or other purposes. Who can do this? Typically is your own institution, your own IT team, because no one else will have access to your IT system. No one else would have the permission to go to your system and to set up this kind of connectors. Depending on the university, this is something that might be outsourced, might be done in-house, that you might have a commercial provider for. And so it's really a quick needs analysis. As I've said, the source code is available for inspection and as well for suggestions of how it can be improved, but there are no costs associated with doing the connection as such. Of course, that essentially each institution is responsible for preparing their systems and making sure they're ready for the transition into the next program. I might add, and I think this is widely known by now, but also to kind of close the loop, as part of the priorities for the key action 2, the strategic partnerships, the transition to digitization is one of them. So I imagine that many of the colleagues in attendance are actually looking to use this opportunity to build capacity if and when necessary. But it really is a question that is down to individual universities. And I reckon that I now have, and the question of several signatures or confirmation. So I'm not the greatest person when it comes to multitasking, so I'm sure that I'm not up to speed with all of the questions that have been put there. But I think the distinction needs to be made, and I saw some comments to that effect. Sorry, I was reading another question. So the question, the distinction needs to be made about what is an internal process and what is the data that goes out of the cross-border data exchange. The scope of the OLA is not to redesign internal processes of the universities. And when those exist, presumably you already have mechanisms in place to deal with that. And the question is what kind of adaptation is required, if at all, as the rules are streamlined and move forward. It's not just a question of processes, there's a legal aspect to it as well, and particularly the always complicated question, are we dealing with a contract, are we dealing with something else? The firmer we understand a learning agreement to be, the more unequivocal the commitment towards it also has to be, and this eventually brings us to discussions of how many signatures we want to put into it, and the distinction between essentially confirming that at an institutional level, this is a document that this is something that we can compromise with, to what is an internal process of eventually having several people confirming that, okay, this is something that we're okay with. Very obviously, when you have majors and minors and others, it's not a self-contained process in a single department or faculty. But we need to be clear about this border and the extent to which more complex processes essentially require more complex internal infrastructure. I see a question as well about the updated online learning agreement and the timeline. So what's currently our focus as far as 2020 is concerned is to make sure that the online learning agreement is indeed ready for the next program. And at a very basic level, what that means is that in the first strategic partnership that was funded by the Luxembourg National Agency, and that went from 2015 to 2017, we essentially built the student interface of the online learning agreement. Whilst in the follow-up project from 2017 to 19, which is just ending, the major contribution, the major deliverable was the dashboard, so the university interface. Something that is extremely important that we start by doing now is that we update the source code that powers the student interface, essentially the learning agreement engine, because that is built on code that was developed originally 5 years ago in 2014 by a Polish colleague of ours that then was expanded and built upon and added functionality, but to make sure that it's capable, that it's resilient, that withstands the kind of requests that we will have from year to 2025 and beyond, to make sure that this is indeed a modern infrastructure. So this is first and foremost technical work, which hopefully will be invisible to everyone using the tool. Of course, our goal is to make this as seamless as possible. If we succeed, we will never know that it has been done. It just means that the tool will continue to work properly, stable, and has indeed the capacity to handle thousands more requests than what is currently the case. In that we are operating very much at the capacity of the current tool from a technical viewpoint. The second aspect of the readiness for 2021 essentially means the discussion that we're having here today. How do we want the learning agreement to change? And the starting point, as like I said, is we don't want to reinvent the wheel. There are lots of things that have been improved in 2014. So it's really about focusing on what can be improved that will not disrupt our workflows. And so that is a dialogue between the project actors, the higher education community, the national agencies, the European Commission, so that essentially we have enough time to adapt the LA to what will be the new regulations and the new template. So I wouldn't say that we're fully in control of that process, but of course we are working with our partners, whether it's universities or the European institutions, to make sure that this will work as well as possible. So back to the chat box. So Françoise Paulus, what about the courses not open to exchange students? Well, excellent question. So this is what I said, what I meant when I said that we need partners to come on board. So we built the basic connectors to access each other's course catalogs. But I'm sure that in many cases, and some of this work has already been advanced in the case, for example, of EWP, we also need to agree on a taxonomy of what is available for whom. And this is a discussion we need to have together. We are not at the point where we say we've reached level 1 of this process. We're very much at level 0, if I'm honest with you. So we need to get to level 1, which is to make sure that data can travel and can be embedded. And I'm sure there's going to be a level 2, 3, and 4. At some point, maybe too many levels is not a good thing. And that is exactly to define subsets of information that we can, want, or should share. The question of courses that are not open to exchange students is relatively simple. It just needs to be defined in a very transparent way. And the simple way to do it without, again, hopefully not getting too technical, is to say, okay, we agree that there's a data field, essentially a tick box from a user perspective, that we identify such courses in our system, and that this is applicable to all the connections that we have done. Some universities have very sophisticated solutions in place for managing the course catalogs. I remember the examples of some colleagues from Italy, where in fact there is almost a waterfall of precedences and other things, whether it's for internal or in some cases perhaps also international students. So at some point this discussion will indeed get more complicated. It will be a question as well about curricular design, whether we need to define what are core courses, optional courses, and others. I think subsidiarity principle also applies to this cases, which is there will be presumably a lot of information that does not need to travel to systems outside those of your university. So the rule of thumb is that the more complex the local ecosystem and the infrastructure is, the more self-capable your own IT systems will have to be, and they will cater to your own needs. So one thing is the OLA as reference implementation, and the other thing is extending the OLA capabilities and usage through the AWP network, so that those of you that already solve these issues can continue essentially to work with the tools that you are using. Charlene Massonet, I have a request to repeat the Italian university. I didn't name any Italian university in particular. I was referring to a meeting of the national agency and one of the work groups, where some colleagues pointed out that the connection of the course catalogs can be a very significant effort depending on how complex it has been defined internally into each institution. There is a colleague asking about recording of the webinar. Trine, I have to apologize to you because we did record it, and I'm sure we can publish it to you. It was my mistake. I've only started recording a few minutes into it. I think we maybe missed the first 15 minutes. Sorry for that. We will make what we have available, and this really is my fault. Still browsing your questions. Just give me a second. Okay, I'm going to go with a question from Bernd about whether the course catalog is going to be implemented by you, and you, I think in this case means the project consortia, and then be ready for all of us to be used in our different systems. Now, yes and no. I try to keep it simple, but let's dig a little bit deeper. What we can implement and make available is the connectors. We cannot implement the connectors in your own system. So I think what the projects have tried to do and to some extent succeeded, although I insist that this is a new discussion that we are approaching now. There's not a lot of practice, at least that I'm aware of, on the field that we can base current processes on, is really finding a clear data standard. So if by your question you mean, will you define the connectors? Will you provide us, for example, a reference connector? Yes, that is in fact already done. But we basically need a group of universities to come forward and say, well, we're going to implement this, and then we will see what works and what doesn't, so that we can iterate. There's not going to be a big bang solution for this, in the sense of one solution that is perfect, finished, and just becomes available overnight. I think it's going to have to be a process, and we should be able to start this process today. And I'm encouraged to see so many of you here with us, because I trust some of you will have good contact with your IT teams, and you might be able to convince them to help us out with this question. Françoise, what would you recommend to start with, the latest student idea or the course catalog? That's a really good question, because it's true there is a lot happening. So to give you a very honest answer, I would not recommend to start with the question of the student ID. What you could do at this time with that, in that regard, is essentially to check with your colleagues or your IT teams. I don't know where the knowledge is. Does my university use EduGain? And if not, can we look into it? Because that really is going to be the backbone. I don't think this is a question for international officers to implement themselves. I think it's important that you are aware of it, because you can essentially get the ball rolling internally. I think the course catalog comes also as a second step. And since in 2021, what is foreseen is that it's the usage of the interinstitutional agreements and online learning agreements that will become mandatory, the default for the new program. This is where I would essentially start. So I'd start by getting acquainted with the online learning agreement. If you have your own online learning agreement system, start investigating how you can connect it through the EWP network. There's still work on the technical side happening on this, and beginning of 2020, we're also trying very hard to have some updates and a new infrastructure. With regards to the interinstitutional agreement, there's also a lot of work that we hope will become public in the first weeks of 2020 to add a module in the dashboard to essentially let you manage interinstitutional agreements digitally. Now, as everything that is being done in the field of digitization, and I cannot stress this enough, there is always a hybrid approach. There are cloud tools which are meant for everyone that needs them, but there is also a more powerful way to interact, which is through the EWP network. So for all the universities, and I think we have quite a few here in the chat box that say, listen, we have the tools that we use and we're not keen to just abandon them and start using the dashboard or something else. Then the challenge really is to connect your tools. And again, this is a task for your IT teams, and all of this documentation, and I'll write it here on the chat box. Oops, sorry. Excuse me. Okay, my chat box is not cooperating. Maybe one of the colleagues can help me. So if you need to connect your own tools, what I would suggest you is to check in with your IT teams and essentially refer them to something called Erasmus Without Paper, EWP for short, Competence Center. From here, you can quickly reach what is called the developers page, which is where the IT colleagues will find all the documentation, all the source codes, essentially the toolkit that they will need to start doing this connection. As many of you probably know, there's a third use case, which is universities that have, thank you very much, appreciate seeing the link so quickly. So there are also universities that don't run the systems. They will work with providers, commercial or otherwise. And many of these providers are also part of DWP. So in that case, we have to encourage you to get in touch with them. I think many of you probably already had some kind of feedback. Obviously, we don't control the calendars of companies like SOP or Move On, but I think it's only fair to say that they're working hard to make sure that their clients are going to be amongst the first to benefit from that. So the exact rollout, so the exact calendar where this becomes available through their systems, it's of course a matter of between the client and the provider. So some of this information eventually might become public, but you know, it's I think the point where you need to check in with them. Let me see if I can still pick up on some more questions. Sorry for keeping waiting. I'm trying to find questions that haven't been touched upon yet. Okay, just a quick comment on something that Benjamin said about the fact that universities are heterogeneous. And yeah, I just wanted to essentially agree with you. It's of course funny to say that the EU does not see these facts. I'm not sure I would agree on that point. I think this speaks exactly to what we're trying to point out. There are different ways to connect. There are different mechanisms that hopefully will adapt as well as possible to the different needs of each of the institutions. But a lot of this has been considered in terms of the design of the projects, make sure that the approach is as inclusive as possible. Trina slides, yes, absolutely. I don't know, I can't tell you where they're going to be, but presumably we're just going to put it on our website, the link, whether it's going to live on the OLA website or others to be checked, but give us a little bit of time and we'll definitely make sure that they become available. I'm still scanning the chat box. I'm picking up, coming back to the question of multiple signatures, which again, it's a tricky subject. It's really, I think, there are so many realities out there. I already spoke to the fact that, when you look at the landscape of institutions take part in Erasmus, you have anywhere from universities that send more than 2,000 students a year to institutions that send half a dozen or so. And so I think the challenge here is to find something that works for everyone. I already spoke to the notion of what to distinguish internal processes from what is the formal aspect of providing a kind of validation that is transparent, transportable, and essentially as strong as possible. There's something else that I wanted to mention, more of a personal remark perhaps, but also out of the discussions we've had in the consortium, also with the UF universities, which is the fact that the bigger the university, the bigger the entropy, the more difficult it is to design processes that are seamless, that are comfortable to live with. And so I completely understand that the real challenge, and we've been saying this for years, in fact, it's not so much technological. We're not putting a man on the moon. I think it's to make sure that the technological solutions do not disrupt, or that eventually they are catalysts for also streamlining internal processes. But I think it's also important to say that while there might be a big threshold to go over in larger universities to say, okay, here's how we're going to retool our processes. The bigger the volume of data exchanges, of volume of mobilities, also the bigger the incentive to try to find ways to make the administrative process a little bit more painless, if you will. And we've already seen some indication of this in a survey that is currently open to users of the dashboard, whereas we did 2 years before, we were trying to measure to understand where there are efficiency gains and where the efficiency gains are not as high as we would have wanted or expected, if there is something that we can do about it. I have to say that it's been quite a journey, because we do get a lot of feedback from many of you. But you need to understand that we also get a lot of contradictory feedback. Oftentimes we have excellent arguments to go down a given road, and also excellent arguments to do its exact opposite. So I think we are also reaching the capacity of what the project can do. And eventually this will become a matter of governance, where we're essentially proposing that national agencies become more involved. It's easier said than done, but of course, many of you will know that there are now digital officers in most, if not all, of the national agencies. So I think there's also an effort from our side to make sure they have the latest information, and we find ways to kind of come together and take the best decisions moving forward. Particularly when we talk about the outline of the next program, what we're saying here is that we're not holding platforms for ransom. We're putting ideas out there so they can be validated by the community, by the national authorities, and of course by the institutional authorities. Yelena, the question about which website, yes, typically it's quicker to update the UF website. So in the news item or the link for the conferences, I think we can put the slide there relatively quickly, and then eventually link as well to the LA website or others. Now, a question from Grevin. This is a tricky one, because I'm not sure I understand it fully. What would be changed for traineeship OLA with no catalog? Will there be a link for companies to directly fill in the information? Now, the first thing I have to say to Grevin and to all of you is that unfortunately, my expertise on OLA-related matters does not extend to questions of traineeships. There are other colleagues in the team, and particularly in the consortia, that have a lot more experience than I do. I sense that part of the answer has to do with the fact that when we're dealing with traineeships, we're not necessarily dealing with course catalogs. And so there is a bigger question, in fact, about how do we facilitate the process from the side of the companies in terms of the administration. And this is perhaps an opportunity to say that some of you will know that there is a beta version of a learning agreement for traineeships, but this version is not connected to the dashboard. So it still relies, as it was previously the case for the OLA for studies, on the students initiating the process. And unfortunately, it remains invisible to the international officers. Now, obviously, we are aware that this is something we're very keen to fix and to improve. The reason why we are at this point yet is because first, this was something that we did on top of the project deliverables. So, we just found some time and goodwill to try to add this functionality, because we were very aware of how important it is. but there are also some legal questions that concern how can the GDPR aspects, and particularly when you leave the provisions for data exchange between academic partners, to start involving with other kind of organizations, also from a legal viewpoint, how we can make sure that these are appropriately respected. And so this is a question that is also being looked up in the context of the LA 3.0, and that our commitment is to do progress as quickly as possible, because of course we want to bring those systems together, but we shouldn't do the connection before we have a measure of clarity on the legal aspects. Maybe this is something that we can take up on the next webinar as well. It's becoming a long chat box, so I'd invite, if there are questions that were not picked on, just feel free to copy paste them and drop them on the chat box. It will make it a little bit quicker. If other colleagues want to take the floor, again, we can try to do this by opening mics. If I don't know if it would work, but we can try to make it work if you agree. And I've also received a few private questions that might not be visible on the general chat, and what I'll try to do is I'll try to reply to these colleagues by the end of the Q&A, because it will be easier to just take a few minutes to write them directly. One question from my side to all of you perhaps is whether there are things we've forgotten. There are things that are very important to you that we should consider adding to the policy recommendations we're working on. So to pick up on something that Taiga said at the very beginning, but maybe was not particularly clear, where we are at now in terms of project deliverables is preparing policy recommendations as part of the closing of the LA 2.0. And so this will be discussed at a conference in Luxembourg, which will take place next February. I'm not going to advertise it because unfortunately it's pretty much full as we speak. There are very few places available, but of course the information about it is online. And of course that these documents will be, published as widely as possible so that they can also facilitate our discussions. The idea of the webinar today was to give a sneak preview of some of the ideas that we're working on. We're not at the moment of having a final version, but for us it's very useful to be able to test and see what kind of reactions and feedback we might have from your side. So eventually, maybe not all, it really depends on what the consortium is going to decide, but at least some of these ideas will be put down in paper and then circulated as one of the project deliverables. Ivan, that's a really good question. So what kind of support is organized for the LA? So I'm going to start by answering your question, or the question, which is, I don't know, but I imagine many of you have experience of doing strategic partnerships yourself. In the context of the current project, we don't really have the capacity to do a proper helpline. We do go out of our way to try to handle as many questions and comments as we can, but I would be lying to you if I said there is a team of 2 or 3 or 10 people that have this as their main mission. So we are talking about something that comes out of a strategic partnership. We've raised the issue, and we're discussing the issue with the European Commission of how is it that we can make sure that there's sufficient support. And eventually this should be something similar to what you described in terms of the ticketing system of the mobility tool that is used by the national agencies. So in terms of what, for example, was linked before, the competence center, the effort there is to essentially start compiling as much information as we can to make it available, and eventually that could be expanded through a ticketing system. Regrettably, we're not there yet. And so there's also a discussion to be had as to whether we focus on answering questions coming from national agencies and whether national agencies would have the capacity to then liaise with their beneficiaries directly. But I think this is to be decided. So for the time being, I'm sure that some of you must have sent suggestions that we simply didn't react to, and this is not out of goodwill, but really a very practical question of capacity. We do try our best to accommodate suggestions because it's very useful as well to have feedback from colleagues that are not in the project, help us think a little bit outside of the box. But particularly in the context of the next program, I think it's something that needs to be strengthened and ensure there is sufficient capacity. And so that's a decision that will have to be taken at the political level. Trine, thank you. I would essentially repeat what you said. Testing the tools is incredibly important. I'm sure that some of you have already were working on the Erasmus program in 2014 when the mobility tool came along, and might have some good or not so good memories of what it was to get things to work. I think in the current roadmap for the digitization of the program, we really strongly insisted in saying, okay, we need to have milestones, we need to have cut-off dates for shifting procedures, but there needs to be an intellectual honesty about the process, which is to say we do that provided that the tools are fit for purpose. Now, in some tools like the LA, we already have several years of getting feedback from the users, and we have a pretty good idea of what works and what could work better. Others that will become available in the meantime, they will undergo the testing process, which is going to be open to everyone. And a lot of this will also, of course, be channeled through the national agencies. So that's a really important message, I think, particularly as far as 2020 is concerned. If you haven't started, checking out, testing, connecting, identifying how you're going to go digital as per the use cases I mentioned previously, it's a very good time to do so, because there is not a lot. The next program is going to come very quickly indeed. Elena Paños, the dashboard will be updated and problems with the download. I don't know if this is a known bug and what's going on with the 40% of the OLAs that you get a wrong file notification. It's something that I suspect it's connected to what I mentioned, that we need to update the source code of the main OLA engine to make sure it works smoothly. But there are updates foreseen to the dashboard. In fact, what we're doing is trying to prioritize what are the most urgent updates, because we have a long list of questions, requests, ideas that we would like to implement it. So the work on the dashboard will be continued. The EWP project is coming to an end as of this month in December, because the dashboard is now being integrated in the EWP ecosystem, but there's still a lot of things foreseen in 2020, particularly for the second half of 2020. So the next update is really concerned the addition of the new model about the interinstitutional agreement. And I expect that this is still to be confirmed, but I expect that we will have the capacity to resume the maintenance work. It's starting to get quite a large ecosystem in terms of systems that need to talk to each other. I hope that the error that you're reporting can be solved relatively quickly, but it would have to be checked with the technical teams. Okay, everyone agrees with Trine. That's pretty cool. I don't know if you agree with the notion that testing is important, or with the, yeah, okay, I think we're on the same page regarding the testing. Filter options. Okay, Bernd, 2 questions. I'll try to go quickly. Extend filter options to students by date. Yes and no. There are options that currently correlate with the structure of the LA. We simply cannot put a filter that says from the 1st of January, because that data set is not available in the LA. So this brings us back to the templates and what we can do in terms of filtering. The willingness is there. It's just that it's a question we've gotten a lot. And so until we decide that the date, excuse me, the day of arrival departure is also part of the LA, we're limited as to the filters that we can set up. Another way to solve this is when all the steps are part of the ecosystem and this information can be fetched from another document, and this is part of the planning for the next program. Opening up to non-Erasmus partners. Now you are preaching to the choir. That's something we would really like to do. In fact, the very first version of the LA that we've tested back in 2015, we've tested with students from Mexico, from China, from India, from Ukraine, from a number of countries that were non-program countries. What happened is that we had to, in order to make sure that things like filtering options were resilient, we had to start narrowing down what was open text fields. And this is something that is important for the next program. In order to have structured data, we need to identify whether it's drop-down boxes and all of those things. So there's work to be done there, but it's definitely something that would be very pleased. Also, because we know that many of our partners outside of the program countries don't necessarily have the best IT infrastructure in the world. So I think there's also a moral argument to say that they should have access to and benefit from the work of digitizing the Erasmus program. Which, again, something that I hope that it can happen relatively soon. Elena, it would be great if the sending institutions were to receive the final LA automatically once it has been signed by the receiving institution. I agree with you in principle, and this was the case at least at some point in the past. We have also had lots of colleagues saying, we don't want to receive the notification because we just fetch them through the dashboard. This presumes that the dashboard fetching is indeed working as it should, and there's no excuses for that to not be the case as we move forward. So no strong opinion there. I think it's really about what kind of behavior the community wants. Technically, it's not a problem as such. It's, are we overwhelmed with notifications? Are we comfortable to, in principle, that was actually the original use case. To be honest, I thought it was still implemented as such. Uppsala University, if there is an update on the LS that will be connected to the AWP and to the MT, the mobility tool. Now, I wish I could answer this question. I'm afraid I don't have the authority to do so. From the side of the European University Foundation, we've raised this several times, and it's one of the issues that we discussed with the Commission. Our understanding is that, yes, it is on the agenda. There is the intention to improve this, but it wouldn't be appropriate for me to confirm, deny, or to make any announcements because I think some of these issues are being figured out. I would just try to address your question on a somewhat optimistic tone. I think that will be the case, but it's something that we'd have to refer to the national or the European authorities. There is something that I can mention because I see Trine also touching upon the question of the LS. There is something that is, I think, already public in the context of the Erasmus and further development, which is the notion that, for example, when it comes to student identification, we will want to pave the way for a smoother integration of the OLS. And so I think one of the scenarios, and again, please take this with a grain of salt. I don't want to overstep what the boundaries of what we can argue are. But I think one of the use cases that is being considered is the notion that if you reported the draft mobilities to the mobility tool, that what are currently the licenses could be automatically issued in the background, if you will, in such a way that essentially for the student, they could receive a notification saying you're welcome to access to LS. And by virtue of having the same identifier, which is a current obstacle from a technical viewpoint in the current system, that essentially the system could check, oh, okay, this student has been nominated, so right of way in order to access the tools. It's a very vague approach, but just to give you a sense of some of the discussions that we have been party to. And again, I hope that there will be some progress that that we can make. So students names. Okay, Krevin, there is a question you've asked about if the LA is accepted, would it mean that original signature won't be required from legal viewpoint? Insurance, it's still not clear. I actually think it's quite clear, and I don't want to go as far as to say that there might be specific country regulations where there's still some polishing to be done, but there is an European directive on the usage of digital signatures. I think Taiga touched upon the question that we want to upgrade the signature system that is currently used, which is of course a compromise between what is widely available and easily deployable and others. And so it should be possible to have a digital signature validated in the learning agreement also from a legal viewpoint. That's our understanding. The reason why I'm being somewhat assertive on this point is because I remember in 2015-16, this was something that was coming up a lot in many universities saying, oh, we're not allowed to use this kind of signatures. And in some cases, actually the national authorities and the national agencies have stepped in. And I think they've played a central role in clarifying that there were countries where this is a widespread conception, but technically and from a legal viewpoint, this was in fact not an obstacle. Again, I can't, I'm not a legal scholar. I cannot say this is the case for all 34 program countries. And I'm almost sure that there are countries where regulations might still be passed. We also have cases of countries that are not part of the European Union. There are program countries and there might be a greater décalage between legal frameworks. But at this point, I don't think it should be the main obstacle for proceeding as we would like. Yannick, could you please make a more detailed list of the updates that are working on at ULA available to the universities? Yes and no, we can, and this is in fact public information because it concerns the program deliverables. There is a good reason why we don't, is because we are working on things that we don't know if they're going to work. So the moment that we have information that a new functionality will indeed be ready for what we call production environment to essentially become public and available, we will try to do a better job of communicating that. If I would give you the list of everything we're working on, I think it would be very poor expectation management, because alongside with basic functionality, we're also trying to develop more advanced functionality, and we might not know at this point whether we're going to be successful or that or not. So that's also why we take some caution when it comes to announcing what is it that we are aiming to do. I think everything I've said in this webinar, ranging from questions of connecting the OLA for traineeships to the dashboard, to perfecting what is to upgrading the core engine of the learning agreement. These are key building blocks that eventually will be rolled out further. Same is true, of course, for new dashboard modules like the Interinstitutional Agreement Manager, which is a deliverable of the current Erasmus Without Paper project. I know that this is difficult to follow, and believe me, it's also difficult for us to manage so many battlefronts, if you will. So what I could say is, we will try to do a better job of communicating this. Typically, communication is the last thing that we have the time to deal with, as in many other European projects, because we have the technical aspects, we have the implementation, the daily maintenance of the infrastructure. And so I'll take that as a challenge for us to up our game. Françoise is asking if for those who are already registered to Luxembourg meeting, if you need to bring something. The short answer is not really, but bring the phone or a tablet or a laptop, because we're still working on some demos that maybe you can interact with, but it's a plenary format conference. There are so many colleagues that will be with us in Luxembourg that we're not going to really have the opportunity to break into workshops. Also because many of the colleagues that are coming have been to previous conferences, they, I think, have pretty good familiarity. So we're going to try to focus more on the idea and the analysis part of the discussion rather than on the tryout. But it doesn't hurt if you have something that you can connect to the internet with and maybe do a trial or do a demo with us. Thank you, Bernd. To be honest, we're approaching the 4 p.m. Unlike Taiga, I don't have to take a flight, so I don't mind sticking around a little bit longer. And again, I'm sorry because I'm sure there are questions that I've missed in the chat box. I'm trying to scan them. Arietta Clavus, can we follow the Luxembourg meeting online? It's something that we're checking with the host. I'm sorry that I cannot confirm it yet. We thought that was going to be the case. There was a change on the amphitheater that we're going to be using in February. And so we're still waiting for a green light, whether it's possible to set up the equipment there. We will try to publish this information as soon as we know. That was the idea, because when we have workshops, it's difficult to stream that. When it's a plenary, we try to, and it should be a lot easier. So thank you for mentioning it here. Bernd, it will be a pleasure to see you here next time again as well. Yeah, well, and Françoise and Bernd and all the colleagues, I really appreciate as well the positivity. The truth is that I think we have a really good project team. It's been an utter pleasure, and I think I'll use this as an excuse for my next slide. So this is really the consortia for the OLA project, EWP project, the My Academic ID project. I think my closing statement, at the risk of missing something important from the chat box, is that this is about universities developing solutions for themselves, not waiting for the European institutions to come and tell us what we have to do, what we have to use. And I think this is the perfect way, as much as possible, to make sure that the next program is going to work for all of us. It's true there is a lot of work. It's true that it's also a very ambitious effort, because it's a very big problem. I think to make this work, I would repeat what Trina said, which is, let's test this together, let's share information, let's prioritize what needs to be changed and in what way as much as possible. Admittedly, this is not just a project, this is something that is obviously growing into becoming much bigger than that. And so thank you all very much for coming today, for your time, for your questions, for your interest. And we'll try to keep polishing updated information with you. I will stick around a few extra minutes. I will try to reply to private questions I've got in the chat. And yeah, I look forward to see you all at the next webinar. And in the meantime, have an excellent Christmas and a very happy New Year. So thank you all.